this will give you a sense of what we experienced, or while we were there, how things changed literally within days, and then what our trip home was. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what life cruising in the Caribbean is like, so that you won't think it's always a pandemic. They say that some days are better than others, and that what Brenda likes to say is being on a boat is like being in prison with the possibility of drowning. And during the pandemic, that's pretty much how we felt. One of the good things about an event, or being in a situation like we were in the Caribbean, is you endure it once, but you can talk about it forever. And I've written a number of articles, and I'm excited to share with you our story tonight. This is a picture of Pandora during the lockdown in Falmouth, Antigua, where we were for a good chunk of that time. There we go. Oops, I'm having trouble getting the next slide up. Bear with me here.
Yeah, why is it doing?
Here we go. Just to give you some context as where we are, the yellow line represents the trip that I take every year. I say I because Brenda does not generally, well, never has gone with me on the trip down to the Caribbean. Just to give you a sense of context here, the blue arrow is Bermuda. And certainly Bermuda is about 700 miles, and getting to Antigua is about double that, a little more than double that. Of course, anyone who's spent any time sailing in blue water knows that these trips never go in a straight line. I'm involved as a board member and as a port officer for Antigua with the Salty Dog Sailing Association. Just to give you a context of how many people do this, when we went down last fall, each one of these lines represents a separate boat heading down to Antigua. We had about 50 heading south. Normally in a typical year, the Salty Dog Sailing Association's fall rally has about 80 to 90 boats. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened this year, which was a little bit different. Of course, every group, whether it's the Essex Yacht Club or the Salty Dog Sailing Association or the Ocean Cruising Club, et cetera, all have their unique place in the cosmos. And really, there's a reason to be involved with more than one group, and we are. Just to give, again, additional context to where Antigua is, you can see here on my cursor, it's a little bit small, but Antigua is one of the most eastern points in the Caribbean. It's in the bottom of the Leeward Islands, and the distance from, say, the British Virgin Islands down to Grenada is just several hundred miles. So it's a fairly compact area, but just north of the Caribbean. Antigua is really quite a spectacular place. I cannot emphasize enough how wonderful this is. During the time of the age of sail in the Caribbean and the height of the sugar trade, this was very hotly contested between the French and the English controlled the island for most of that period. The harbor in the foreground, which is English Harbor, was where the Navy was headquartered, and then in the background is Falmouth Harbor, and that was where that was sort of the center of commerce during that period. They're extremely well protected with reefs and make it a very secure harbor, even immediately inside of English Harbor, close to the ocean. And part of the reason for that is it's on the western side, and with the prevailing trade winds, I'm not getting my, oh, there we go. The trade winds are blowing on the other side of the island. For those of you that are not familiar with Pandora, she was in the club the Club Marinefield for a while last summer. She's a 47-foot Aerodyne 47, built in Helsinki, Finland, and launched in 2007. She's a composite construction designed by Roger Martin out of Newport, Rhode Island. Really, the design is somewhat similar, or has some of the characteristics of some of the early open 450 boats. She's a pretty fast boat. We cruise at about 8 knots most of the time, and I've had sustained speeds of 10, 11 knots. I guess by comparison to the Vendée boats, that's barely moving, but believe me, it's pretty thrilling when things are piping up. So this is me and Brenda pre-pandemic, when we were in in hanging out with friends. This is aboard a boat named Kaluna Mu. We're very good friends of ours. They were our mentors with the very first time we headed south to the Caribbean, actually to the down the intercoastal waterway. This is how we looked a little later when the pandemic struck. You may recognize one of these from your bilge. This is a makeshift mask that Brenda made for me when the pandemic struck, using an old handkerchief and a bilge diaper, something that we had plenty of on the boat, but fortunately we had one that wasn't soaked with oil. Of course, Brenda was a little more stylish than I was. She was wearing an N95 mask underneath this. And think of how much fun that would be in 90-degree Caribbean temperatures. We were, it was overnight, literally overnight, and I'll talk a little bit more about that before, as we go further along. We were in St. Lucia. We actually arrived in St. Lucia with the purposes of having a refrigerator fixed. We'd been having trouble for several months with it, and I had to have a custom-made unit sent down. It was built in California, and by the time I got it, it was almost 3 months later. We were doing okay. We got it installed, and then literally less than 1 week later, the entire Caribbean shut down. We really struggled to figure out what to do. Social distancing in the Caribbean is not all that difficult because the winds are blowing a gale all the time out of the east. So we hung out on the dock periodically, but this was planned to be a 1 week stop at the marina in St. Lucia, and we ended up staying there for an entire month because there was absolutely nowhere to go. During that period, flights were canceled. All the commercial flights canceled. The minute this all started, some of our friends took off for Grenada. And before you knew it, Grenada was so overpacked with boats that they completely shut that country down. Trinidad was shut down, where most of the people that we know who stay in the Caribbean over the winter leave their boats. That was shut. It's still shut. You still can't go into Trinidad. These are friends of ours that left their boat without any plans, really. They just left the dock and chartered an airplane to fly to Puerto Rico with the hope of then getting home to the U.S. Brenda and I were really struggling with what to do. We really didn't want to leave Pandora in the Caribbean for what we thought would be 2 years. We have friends that have left their boat there that they still haven't gone back. They might go back next fall. But we finally made a decision that we were going to head up to Antigua. Originally, we wanted to go to the American Virgin Islands. The problem was that was completely overrun with boats. And those of you that have been to, say, St. John know that you have to take a mooring, and every single mooring was full, and they did not allow rafting. So we didn't want to go there and find that there was no place to go once we got there. We had other friends that just literally left their boat on the dock, hired someone to put it away, didn't even turn the refrigerator off, and jumped on the next flight. Friends of ours that went to Grenada found that once they got there, there were no flights whatsoever. They had boats hauled, and then they had to put them back in the water. It was completely chaotic. So what we decided to do was to work our way up. The next island available was Antigua, which was 200 miles away. We thought we'd wait and see what happened there. I had crew all lined up. They had said, oh, yeah, we'll come, but one thing led to another, and they didn't. So the first trip we took was an overnight, running from here down in St. Lucia, where we were, up to Antigua, 200 miles away. In the process, we crossed past Martinique, Dominica, Guadeloupe, and headed up. That trip happened once the borders were all closed. We'd heard all kinds of crazy stories in the French islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, where anyone who wasn't a French national was forced to leave. That turned out to not be completely true, but the point was that one of our more popular anchorages, they literally kicked everybody out. And this French frigate was patrolling the island, and as we passed around dusk the first night out, he shadowed us for quite some time. It was incredibly unnerving. This is the way we normally, when we arrive in Antigua, we tie up in Nelson's dockyard, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. It's an absolutely spectacular spot. And this was a shot of the 25 some odd boats that were there when we first arrived last fall. Pandora is down there on the left. What happened when we came back? Literally a couple of months later, it looked like this. There was the dockyard was more or less closed, and no one was allowed to come ashore. Over the next couple of weeks, they forced us to stay on the boat literally 24 hours a day. We were allowed to go ashore occasionally for 30 minutes or so, 1 hour, around 8 a.m. in the morning. Only one of us was allowed ashore. Literally for 2 months, Brenda went ashore a single time. We just basically sat on the boat and read. We couldn't socialize with our friends. We were actually, suddenly we were in a position of where one day everybody seemed like a safe bet, and the next day, literally, we felt like everyone that we came in contact could conceivably kill us. Shortly before this all happened, we had heard of one of our fellow sailors, a Salty Dog sailor that had gone up to St. Martin. His wife had flown home for the holidays, shortly after the holidays, to visit family, couldn't get back. A few weeks later, he came down with a virus on his boat, got very, very sick. He had to be evacuated. They flew him to Guadeloupe. Did not go well in Guadeloupe. They flew him on a medical evacuation service to Miami, where he died a couple of weeks later. That was the only death we heard of associated with our fleet, and it was very upsetting. We spent literally, this is a very calm time of year, the fall, the Christmas winds have died down. The winds are maybe 10 to 15 knots. It's very, very pleasant down there. Water, of course, is plenty warm. And every day, Brenda would, we would go swimming around the boat. If you wanted, I wanted to tell you to tell Brenda to tell them a little bit about that whole thing.
Well, we were trying to figure out how we could get exercise when we could not go ashore. So I took a walk from the very stern to the bow, and it was 22 steps. And I thought, yeah, a circumnavigation of the boat would be 44 steps, and you'd have to do that a lot to get any mileage. So I decided I guess we'd be swimming around the boat. And there shouldn't have been any dinghies in the water because you were not allowed to leave your boat. But there was another tragic accident of a woman who had been swimming, was run down by a local, one of the visiting boats like us, when they were zipping around too quickly in their dinghy and they didn't see her, and she died. So I pretty much swam where one of my arms could touch the boat because I figured a dinghy's not going to come that close to us. So
it was a very scary time. We were able to, even at the best of times, provisioning in the Caribbean can be a little challenging. There's a nice little grocery in English Harbor where we would go, but anytime we went, we had to stand outside the whole 6-foot thing, and they would only allow, I think, 4 people in the store, so I'd have to stand in line for an hour in the morning. Fortunately, we're pretty self-sufficient on Pandora. We have a washer and dryer, although we don't use the dryer, just the washer. But because of the breezes being pretty consistent, we can hang our laundry, and by the time the next load is done, the first load is dry. And we have a water maker that we run while we're running the laundry. So as the laundry makes it about the same speed as the water maker, the laundry uses about the same speed as the water maker makes it. So we're pretty self-sufficient, except for very rare circumstances. When we leave the U.S., we don't take on water from the outside until we get home. There's usually a fair amount of wildlife activity in Falmouth, but with things being so quiet, it was particularly active. This was a hawksbill turtle that we saw, who came by and visited us every day. We didn't see many. You don't see many dolphins down in the Caribbean, but this one came by, a small pod, would visit us most every day. We have flamingos, although this one didn't do much. She does have a couple of babies, but everybody tried to find their best way to keep active. There's a lot of children in the Caribbean, people taking time off, and I'm sure you heard stories of boats heading across the Pacific that during the pandemic and suddenly discovered that they had no place to go. This was a boat that we ran into in Antigua with a couple of kids, and every evening they would do whatever they would do to try to keep occupied. I don't relish trying to keep small children occupied on a boat where you can't go ashore. I thought this was very amusing. If you look closely, you'll see he's on the phone. I can only imagine what happened. Maybe it's like, Dennis, get in that boat and do not come back. Call your mother. But everyone tried to do what they could to keep occupied. Of course, some people had an easier job of it. This boat had all kinds of toys. Certainly, there was plenty of people who were quarantining under the most difficult circumstances on their 300-foot yacht. Of course, everybody has to have a dog aboard. This guy seemed quite content. So we were there for, I don't know, a month maybe in Antigua, and then decided to go. And the only way to check out, normally you can check in and out in Antigua 3 or 4 different places, but everything was closed except for St. John, which is basically a commercial harbor. It's filthy, not a good place to go. And the day that within 24 hours of our departure, we went over to St. John and checked out. We put our dinghy up on board. There's been many people that I know that carry their dinghy in davits, and I've heard absolutely horrible stories about them breaking loose on mid-passage. Those of you that have spent time sailing in the ocean, things can get rough, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Other people were able to find a little more comfortable ways to get their boats home. This is Topaz, one of the big J's. This particular shift is called the Big Lift for obvious reasons. It's quite amazing to watch them pick up a yacht, a 100-foot yacht, and put it up on the boat. You may have heard of Topaz. They were the boat that was involved with a collision with Svea in March of last year during one of the regattas, and Topaz ran right up on and over the bow of another J boat and did tremendous amount of damage. No one was hurt, but these guys, when you get into an accident with a 100-foot boat, it's not a good thing. You may recognize Maiden. She was skippered by Tracy Edwards in a whitbed race in 1989. She was the first all-woman crew, supported by the president of Jordan, King Hussein of Jordan.
I forgot.
I think so. He underwrote that particular trip, and they won several legs of that whitbread race, and that changed women's sailing forever. And since then, women have been taken much more seriously in ocean racing. Okay, so we left Antigua. We left in the evening. It's a 200-mile run up to the American Virgins. And note that we couldn't go to Tortola or to the British Virgins because they were closed. And we wanted to head to the U.S. Virgins because once we cleared in there, we were basically in America. And that was important because Tortola is still not open. In fact, one of our member boats went through to Tortola waters a couple of months ago and was arrested. Their boat was impounded, and it cost them $4,000 and 11 days in jail before they were able to get out of the BVI. And all they did was stray into British waters on a day sail out of the American Virgins. Everyone was very concerned and remains very concerned about safety. This is as we were leaving Antigua. We spent a night at sea. We had a really good start. Things were easy. And after about, as the evening progressed and we got there the next morning, the wind really picked up and it got quite rough. And Pandora tracks really, really well in tough conditions. She's really designed for that. Even surfing down waves, and not with Brenda, thank God, but I've surfed down 20-plus foot waves at sometimes close to 20 knots. And even the autopilot then, she's stable enough for it to hold her. But things got rough, and the reason I mentioned that is Brenda was quite unhappy and didn't feel well. She suffers from acute seasickness. With the patch, it gets a little bit better. But when things really get unpleasant, she just doesn't do very well. And I knew that, and that was why we didn't want to have to take the boat home by ourselves. So here we are in the U.S. Virgin Islands in St. John. It was spectacular. Every single mooring was taken. I have to say, the St. John, the water in St. John is pretty remarkable. Now, I'm going to get back to Salty Dawg for a moment because every spring, Salty Dawg does a rally to the U.S. leaving from either BVI or the American Virgins. So we usually have 15 or 20 boats. And as we were sitting in St. Lucia, I called the president of the group and said, I think we should consider opening up the rally and changing the rules. In other words, don't have any rules. Normally we have a lot of requirements about communications gear, but to say, let's just let anyone and everyone come in and we'll help them go back to the US. And we did. And they put together a committee of about 15 people that were going to be shoreside support. And ultimately, 284 boats signed up to get help in figuring out what to do next. Some went to other islands, some went to Mexico, some went to Honduras, and then 184 boats ultimately went to the US. One incredible complexity at that time is normally you head out on a trip and you can stop various places, stop in Puerto Rico, stop in the Bahamas, but that was completely closed. You were forbidden for going into Bahamian waters. And the guy up in the upper middle, Rick Palm, he coordinated with the Bahamian government. And we had to get boat by boat individual approvals just to stop and anchor. And that'll mean something more in a moment. So our trip, leaving from, I guess, point number 4 there, which was the American Virgins, and those are just waypoints along the way, where you see the red triangle. About halfway through the trip now, we're 500 miles of the 1,000 miles up to Fort Lauderdale. We received information from Chris Parker, who's our weather router. We talked to him every day on the sideband and got emails. And he said that the first tropical storm of the season was forming in Gulf of Mexico, and that we had to stay put and let the prefrontal information, prefrontal weather go across Florida and the northern Bahamas before we left. We did not want to get stuck in that. So we stayed there. Now, for those of you that, actually, I'm going to stop that for a moment and show you this next chart. So what this was, this is predict wind, and this is the flotilla that left about a week before us. The flotillas with all these boats left over an 11-week period, leaving everything from the very beginning of April through the middle of May, or actually after that. And this, you can see, is a number of groups involved. We had 3 routes. One we called the Southern Route, Route 1, and that was considered the easiest because you can see by the arrows, it's mostly a downwind run.
He's actually doing a pretty good job. Ooh, thank you.
And I just heard someone say something. I thought maybe I was having audio problems. Group 2 was going to go through the Bahamas, and they were allowing you a single stop. You had to go to particular marinas and so forth. And group 3 was going to go straight up in the North Atlantic. The problem is, as you can see from the red area, early in the spring, the weather just stops. I mean, it's just terrible up there. And one of the boats, I think, this one here, got into some trouble. And it took them 2 weeks to make that run. I made a run to Essex in 8 days. It is not a good time of year. They got stuck, I think, in 2 gales during that period. So the first part of the trip was pretty good. We didn't run into any serious problems with the weather. It was pretty easy downwind sailing with about 20 knots behind us. And on a dead downwind run on a boat like Pandora, 20 knots is about perfect. Unless your apparent wind is just too low. Every day, I've been keeping a blog for, over 10 years, and every day I would send a blog post off to my son, who would post it, or to his partner Melanie, and things were going pretty well. So we stopped in Great Anagua. We had gone by Great Anagua on our way to 2 years ago, back in 2016, and we decided not to stop because of weather issues, and also it's known as being a pretty unpleasant anchorage, which it proved to be. The problem is with the prevailing wind being out of the east and northeast is that you get this wraparound swell. So you can see from these soundings that this is in feet. You're talking just a few miles offshore, it's 8,000, 7,500 feet deep. Within about a quarter of a mile offshore, it rises up to about 20 feet. We sat there for 3 or 4 days. The boat rolled horribly, and at night there was mosquitoes. It was just a miserable spot to be. At one point, I went swimming. The water clarity was unbelievable, like 100 feet. All I could think of was that a quarter of a mile away or less, it was dropping to 3,000 feet, and imagining some horrible thing coming up and biting my leg. Steven Spielberg ruined, just
Yeah.
absolutely ruined my sailing for me forever. So here we were in Great Anagua, and I just to again give some context. We now had to head east, past north of Cuba through the Old Bahama Channel, which is extremely narrow. I'll talk a little bit about that. But we finally just got to a point of where we just couldn't stand it any longer. We just had to go. So Chris Parker said, "Go ahead, but you got to keep your speed down." So the wind is now freshened to 20, 25 knots directly behind us. We had a triple reef in the main, put the jib away. I pulled the main directly to center of the boat. So now most of it was not even exposed to the wind, and we were still doing better than 7 knots. And Chris was very concerned we were going to run right into the middle of this prefrontal stuff. So I put a big heavy bucket and trailed it over the stern, and finally that slowed us down. But boy, it was a brute to get back onto the boat. So we finally, after like just 3 or 4 hours of towing this bucket behind us, I got a new report from Chris saying, "Uh-oh, never mind, the rules just changed, you have to speed up." So in came the bucket, no simple feat, and then things got a little hairy. So at this point, we're heading down towards the Old Bahama Channel, which basically goes just south of the Bahama Banks, and things got really dicey. We started picking up squirrels. It was blowing like stink, close to 30 knots. And at this point, we're going through one of the busiest shipping channels in the world, the Old Bahama Channel. Here on what you have a separation zone, and you can see from the scale here, that red to purple is only 3 nautical miles. And you see from the soundings, we're talking 25 feet deep, and it's not real well marked, so you have to stay away from it. The problem was, at this point, it's absolutely pitch dark. We're just a few miles north of Cuba. We could see a few lights here and there. And Brenda was not doing real well. She didn't feel comfortable really being in the cockpit alone. So I'm sleeping on the floor, setting an alarm for every 15 minutes or something to make sure she's not feeling well and can't really stay awake. And the depth finder started acting up, but I'm going to let Brenda take over for a second.
So generally on these rallies home, you need experienced crew. And at this point, we couldn't get crew. So Bob is stuck with me. And in the long run, if you ask me how it was, I would tell you it was life and death. That boat, our little boat, was going to just crack up into a bunch of little shards because we kept getting slammed by waves. And my perception of it was the waves were coming from all directions. Bob never once felt that it was life and death, but he did think we got into some serious trouble, maybe 2 times. And he ran below to make sure that the bulkheads were still attached because we were hit so hard, or he was checking to see if any of our portholes had blown out. But that was a very difficult passage. I still feel that I can't believe the boat made it because it was making these horrible creaking sounds. We were being thrown all over the place. And he would keep tightening the sails down when the boat was already creaking. It's stronger than I realize. And now, of course, I don't trust it because I think it's been stressed to the max. And next time we go out in like a zephyr, it'll probably fall apart. But
well, I should add to that. It was hairy, and I think Brenda was just so scared that I will say at one point I did go down below, and at another point a wave hit the stern starboard quarter and went right across the cockpit. We thought we had lost our enclosure, but it turned out it was just water going underneath it and rushing right out the other side. Pandora is an epoxy boat and autoclaved e-glass construction built to code or category 1. The Vendée boats are category 0, and a coastal boat might be 2 or 3, and a runabout category 4 or 5. So she's about as tough a boat as you can get. But it was hairy. There was this is as we were going across past the Cay-Sal Banks, which is a very shallow area of water just south of, kind of diagonal and south of the Bahama Banks, and between that and then on the other side of it is the Gulf Stream in Florida. It's a very narrow area, and it's, as you can see from the AIS returns there, it gets busy. This is a squall that was with us, and it just happened to be heading to the northeast. So here we are, we're trumping along at 7, this is 8 knots over the ground. This is before we even hit the Gulf Stream. And then it just wouldn't go away. And the waves stuck with us. We had 30 knots on the beam with a double reef main, no jib, for better than 8 hours. And it was just exhausting. The boat handled it well, but Brenda didn't. I should note that there was another boat with us that was not too far behind. It was a 40-foot catamaran, and they were pooped, and a wave came right over the stern and went right through their doors and flooded their cabin. They didn't sink the boat, but they did have to stop and anchor in the K-Sail banks in a pretty sketchy spot and try to clean the mess up, and they were ultimately going to Florida. But it was really hairy. And as we got closer to Fort Lauderdale, we were right in the middle of the prefrontal. This, you can see in the distance, this rain squalls, and we would get into fairly clear conditions, and then the rain would hit us again. And then, of course, every once in a while, we'd see one of these, a funnel cloud, which was very unnerving. That was closer to Fort Lauderdale. So now Pandora has a 22-foot boom, and it's heavy, and an aluminum boom. And as we finished up on this trip and we were coming up to the entrance to Fort Lauderdale, I dropped the sail. It was pouring rain. We're now in the middle of the prefrontal stuff. And the boom dropped down. The topping lift was a little too loose, and the gas and the shock, the gas bang had leaked somewhat. So now this thing is banging around and jumping up and down, and it's pitch dark. So I happen to have a bang, a rope bang that I could use to pull it off to one side, but it was exhausted at that point. I'd been up for something like 48 hours with just little cat naps, but we made it. We had other damage. This is my brand new quantum jib. One of the foils on the forestay came loose and started twisting back and forth and just cut right through the sail. It's been repaired now. It looks as good as new. But all in all, we made it. It was a little bit scary, as Brenda said. The final moment, I think, for us, it was really kind of crazy, is we're going up the ICW up to Fort Pierce, and this horrible thunderstorm was bearing down on us. And I thought, okay, we're going to go down, and there's a little spot off to the right across from the marina in Fort Pierce. We'll turn into that. Well, by the time we got there, it was blowing over 40 knots. And we tried to anchor, and I didn't have my headset on. Brenda couldn't really hear me or see me, so we didn't quite turn into the wind the way we planned. We ran over the anchor, and the boat stopped absolutely dead from about 8 knots. The chain went roaring down the side of the boat. It scratched the crap out of it.
I just have to interrupt that. You have to know Bob was on the bow. I ran over the anchor.
Well, and I will say shortly thereafter on the Channel 16, I heard someone say, Pandora, Pandora. That was some pretty impressive seamanship. Good job. So I was feeling like that was like, thank you very much. But overall, the trip was okay. We encountered no locusts. That wasn't so bad. But we made it through. It was a little scary, I'll admit. But I don't want you to think that this is just a horrible place to be. And I'm just going to remind you that we did go to Antigua. How are we doing on time, Brenda? Okay, we're good. So I just want to talk a little bit about Antigua. Back in the right after World War II, the Nicholson family, you'll know them from Nicholson Yacht Brokers, came to Antigua, and Nelson's dockyard at the time was just a derelict place. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's quite beautiful. Interestingly, this was a drone shot taken a few days after the hurricane that ripped through the British Virgin Islands. So normally, just want to remind you that normally it's fun to be there. The boats are anchored stern to Medmore. And if you haven't done that, that can be kind of interesting, dropping your anchor and backing down and throwing lines to someone. This picture proves that if you take enough pictures, you get a good one. And I take a lot of pictures, and this is the Spirit of Bermuda tying up there. Nelson's dockyard is pretty spectacular. It's fun because even though it's been redone and it's a very popular tourist destination, all the businesses, with the exception of one small tourist clothing shop, are marine related. And this is the ruins, which you'll recognize from virtually any picture of Antigua. So normally, and this is not the way it looked this year with all the people that came down with the rally, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but we get a good crowd. We get, right now, there's 100 people from Salty Dog in Antigua. That was last year. One of the things that's great about being there is just seeing awesome boats. This is Ultimotion, which is a French trimaran that holds the world record from a run from Cape Town to Rio de Janeiro. There is just no end to the boats. This one is kind of neat. This is owned by, well, you guessed it, a Russian guy who was built in, it's a $250 million yacht launched in 2018. It's the largest yacht ever made by Fedship. I think it looks like a sneaker, but it's pretty neat inside. This is the master stateroom. I had to show you this. This is understated. All the yachts are not like that, but last year before the pandemic, there were 80 yachts mega yachts in Antigua. They host a fabulous classic yacht regatta in the spring. Of course, you'll recognize Rambler 88, and to her right is ICAP Leopard. Pretty impressive boats, and they're there. There is no end to the gigantic yachts that show up in Antigua. This is not an optical illusion. This is a huge yacht. You'll recognize the Maltese Falcon with her diner rig. We went by that boat a couple of years ago when she was there. She's now in private charter, and they put the sail on the back mast down at night and show movies outside. So it is a beautiful place, and this is a view at sunset from Falmouth. You can't beat that. And of course, who can go wrong with a beautiful moonrise? And off in the distance, this is the kind of thing you see every night. To give you a sense of the scale of these boats, of course, here's a picture of a guy up in the mast. Try to pick him out here, right up at the top of the mast. That's a 200+ foot mast. These are just enormous boats. This is one of the largest sailing yachts in the world. It's owned by Diane van Furstenberg and Barry Diller. It's named EOS. It's over 300 feet long. I don't know what the name of this one is, but it looks like the Titanic. Just beautiful. This is a garçon, as in garçon, will you fetch my helicopter? This is a shadow vessel. The boats are getting so big now, they actually have a 200-foot yacht just to carry their toys. This is Dreamboat, owned by the guy that owns the Atlantic Falcons. This one only cost $180 million. Of course, you cannot beat. The thing about it, it's neat about Antigua is that it rains every day, so you get 1 or 2 rainbows. It's absolutely a spectacular. I just love this place. And can you think of a better place to have breakfast than here at the Admiral's Inn? The Antigua Yacht Club is sort of the center of the community there, and they are really, really supportive. Here is Max Fernandez, who is the Minister of Tourism, and Franklin Braithwaite, the Commodore of the Yacht Club, and I'm presenting them with Salty Dog Burgee. I actually should have put a picture in. I did actually present Franklin with an Essex Yacht Club Burgee a couple of years ago, but I forgot that. Believe it or not, they actually, 2 years ago, they threw a free party for 150 of the Salty Dogs, just decided to do it. And it was pretty remarkable. And the group is it's a very tight group. You know, you head down in a common experience. Sometimes it doesn't go real well, and you all feel like you've become part of a club. This particular year, this is the crew of a boat named Hector. One of their crew members, it turns out, was an organ transplant recipient, and he was in the middle of it. Was a pretty rough ride. It always is a rough ride getting down there. There's a boat from France. It was a big catamaran, and they went over a wave as he was taking his medication, which he has to take every 6 hours, something like that, for anti-rejection medicine, and it all fell into the toilet. And he lost his entire medication, and he was 500 miles from Bermuda. So one thing led to another, and they contacted the United States Coast Guard, who said, what do you need? And they said, we need the medication of XYZ. And they flew it out in a C-130, and that orange can you see there is, they flew around them they're in the middle of nowhere. And they said, are you ready? And they dropped this thing with a big parachute on it. And the crew of Hector retrieved it. They opened it up, and there was a tiny little vial inside of this, of his medication. And they kept circling around and around the boat. And they called them back, and they said, is it good? And they said, yes, it's good. And they said, okay, stand by. We're going to send you the next half of your medication. And they dropped a whole nother thing with this. And you know, they dumped dye markers in the water. They did everything. And I make this point because the U.S. Coast Guard, these aren't even Americans. They're from France, and they called for help, and the Coast Guard went out and helped them. And I think that's a remarkable testimony to the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, of course, when you go to Antigua or the Caribbean, you can't help but think of rum. There I am in my white shirt in the middle there, leading a toast with the Antigua and Barbuda Royal Navy Tot Club. It was formed in 1991 to pick up the tradition that was stopped in 1970 by the British Navy of issuing a tot of rum to every enlisted man, which I guess they were all men back then. But you can go to Antigua and you can join the Royal Naval Tot Club. They have their own rum. I am actually a card-carrying member of the Tot Club. And joining, I won't go into a lot of detail except to say it takes a fair amount of stamina. You have to memorize a whole bunch of arcane information about Lord Nelson. But more importantly, you have to take a tot every night for 14 days. And that tot is 3.5 ounces. And I don't have a lot of reserve buoyancy. And on certain nights, you had to take a second tot. Now, the worst of it is you have to memorize all this stuff, and then you have a 30-minute oral exam after your first tot. So, and I'm not great at memorizing stuff. And believe me, after a couple of nights of that, it's hard to remember anything. Now, Brenda was home during my rush period for the Tot Club, probably the reason I did it, because I had nothing else to do. And she was said to me, I cannot wait till you're finished with this, because every night you call me and you're slurring, and I'm waiting for you to call me when you're sober. So this is the official flag and shirt of the Royal Naval Tot Club. This is the white ensign, which is flown on by the Queen if she's on a boat. The difference is that this particular version is a swallowtail version versus a square end. And this is Anne and Mike that founded it. You can see Mike, as you can tell, he's had a few tots. But it's a really great group, and I will tell you, they go out of their way to support any and all. And through this group, there's some pretty well-heeled people. I've been to cocktail parties on 150-foot schooners. It's amazing. Of course, sometimes we have cocktail parties on Pandora. And normally, when things are not crazy, we get together a lot. You know, you can certainly, you're never lonely. And this is just some of our cruising friends. We had 15 boats that we buddy boated with until the whole Caribbean thing died down or locked down. Of course, you never know who you're going to see. This is Prince Charles, who visited some of our boats a few years ago. Brenda unfortunately missed this because she was too busy choosing what to wear.
Yeah.
And but we this is you can imagine the guy on the left, a friend of ours, and he's sitting there thinking, boy, I wished I dressed up. So I'm going to sort of leave you with some thoughts on this. Imagine, I mean, a few years ago at the Essex Yacht Club, we were home, and when we had New Year's Eve fireworks, I think maybe Brenda and I were the only ones that actually stood outside. A few people did, but it was miserably cold, and it was raining. But this is the way it looks in Antigua, and we were taking these pictures from the bow of our boat. It is pretty spectacular. And I'm just going to give you a couple of slides about where we go beyond that. There's a lot of islands. One of the fun things about the heading south from Antigua for the few hundred miles is the distances between islands are just, you know, a day sail. Now it's a sporty day because you're dealing with the ocean, but this is one of our favorite spots. This is Guadeloupe, and it looks like a little French village. It is very, very charming. The beaches are beautiful. There are people that are fishing. These are sardine fishermen. You may have, I don't know if you've been hearing the news lately, but with everything that's going on in Washington, but this is Mount Pelée in Martinique, and actually this is Dominica, never mind. But I don't have a picture of Pelée right here, but but this there's one of these volcanoes is actually actively erupting right now. It's a little scary. St. Vincent looks like they may have to evacuate 100,000 people. That was actually a picture of Dominica, which is an absolutely spectacular island with beautiful rainforests. And unlike the Bahamas, where it's very arid and you can't grow anything there, there's just an endless supply of vegetables and just wonderful food to eat if you are a little creative and willing to look beyond the things that you see every day. But again, we have a sort of a movable group of people. We do a lot of fun things. Here's a waterfall, 100-foot waterfall. And this is an interesting guy. This is Humpty. He's a wood carving guy. He has this gigantic chainsaw, and I actually hired him to go back into the bush and cut up a log that had fallen down during a hurricane. And he freehand a log, and I should tell you that it was a Sunday morning. We stopped. He got a couple of beers. He's barefoot. He's smoking dope, and he's using a gigantic chainsaw. So I took this wood, I put it on the boat, and I brought it home to build something. We'll see what happens next. But I promise you, his lifestyle may not be sustainable, but the wood was fall, and so we'll see what happens. But it's not every day you get to hire a snake charming, chainsaw, hot smoking, beer drinking guy on a Sunday morning to go. So there's just a lot of really wonderful places. This is Martinique. This is what I meant by, this is back in 1902, this is Mount Pelée, right before the eruption, and this is what it looked like the next day. So you just really have to worry about there's active volcanoes throughout the entire Caribbean. This is how it looks today. Where those boats are anchored, it's over 100 feet deep, so you really have to have a lot of chain to anchor. This is the Fort-de-France, which is the capital of Martinique. We were there for Carnival, and you can see that Pelée off in the distance. It is a beautiful city. This is Fort St. Louis, constructed in the mid-1600s. And of course, what I was much more interested in is working my way through the pastry. But I'm showing you this because this is where we were literally days before the pandemic. Less than 2 weeks before the pandemic hit, we were at Carnival. Now, the first case in Carnival was found on March 4th, and we were there in the second half of February. Imagine what it would have been like if we had been there when the coronavirus had hit. It is quite a spot. I mean, I thought this guy was pretty charming. He was just watching. This was one of my favorites. He came out every day for 5 days, and he would always flash a kind of come hither look. But he had the most amazing outfits. Everybody gets dressed up, and each day has a different theme. They really take this very seriously. I think pretty much almost everyone in the entire country was there each day. Interestingly, though, there was very little police presence. We never saw an ambulance, we never saw a policeman, and there was no safety issues at all. I think this is my favorite outfit, and I have promised myself I'm going to drink a lot of beer going forward. This is an outfit on this young woman made out of beer caps and pop tops. So next time you pop a beer, think of her. Each day has a different theme. On this particular day, and I won't go into a lot of detail except to say that these people have doused themselves in a mixture of coal tar and sugarcane juice, and the smell is absolutely overpowering. And imagine how it feels in the tropical heat to walk down the street covered with sticky sugar. Of course, most of the stuff that most of the sugar cane in Martinique is turned into rum, and you can go again and again to taste rum or do whatever you want to do. And some of the buildings, the manor homes associated with this, are pretty spectacular. There is a thing that goes on in the Caribbean where they have the rum aging in barrels at room temperature, so to speak, which is around 80+ degrees. And every year, 10% of the rum leaks out in the air as evaporation, and they call that the angel share. You walk into this room and it's just absolutely overwhelming. So it's just one place after another. It's pretty spectacular to visit. And all along the way, there's people we can hang out with. There are places that are more secluded. There's places we can go that have resorts. This is a beautiful place. If you want to take a mooring, which we hardly ever do, for $30 a day, you get the run of this place. Pandora is now gray, and I got the idea from this boat, which belongs to Wendy Schmidt, wife of Google chairman, ex-Google chair Eric Schmidt. She's a carbon fiber 170-foot yacht. So I tried to make Pandora look like this, but all I could get right was the color. Cloud 9 is owned by a billionaire, an Australian guy. She's nearly 300 feet long. Just to give you some sense of scale, Endless Summer is 55 feet long, and she's dwarfed by this. You've all seen pictures of the pitons. In fact, down in this area, as I mentioned, there's volcanic eruptions occurring right now. As I took this picture, Pandora was on a mooring in 150 foot of water. People often question me about safety, and the islands are quite safe. The only island that people generally don't stop at is St. Vincent, and this would maybe give you a reason why. Here's a guy roaring by with a harpoon, which made us anxious. Most of them are just beautiful. The boats are brightly colored. It's a very, very pretty place. There's spectacular beaches and so forth and so on. So as I finish up here, I just want to remind everyone that, each 1 year a pandemic doesn't make forever. And even though we had, everyone had to quarantine, get PCR tests, and go through this very elaborate protocol to arrive in Antigua, we had 50 boats head south. And this shows you that there were the pretty challenging conditions for the ones that went down to the Bahamas. Most of them didn't make it for a long time. But one boat, Fat Jack's from the UK, made it in 7 days. Most of the boats took closer to 2 weeks. He averaged over 9 knots, and he did it all by himself. As the season was getting off to a start, this was a view from one of our friends' homes of the Salty Dog fleet. The only boats in Antigua for much of November were from our fleet, and one of our members took this picture and labeled it. But the point in all this is that things will get back to normal down in, this actually was, people are getting together in Antigua now. Antigua has only had 5 deaths and 176 cases of COVID-19, and they have 100,000 people. To compare that is 23 times less than the death rate in the United States per capita. They've been very, very aggressive. There is no quarantining for the heck of it. If you get sick, they put you in a government quarantine facility and they hold you there until you test negative. So they're very assiduous about all of this. So what I would say is don't count out the Antigua as a fabulous place to go. And I'm hoping that this fall, Peter Harding, for one, will be crewing on Pandora, I hope. That's you, Peter. And maybe someone else from the Essex Yacht Club will come along and we'll have an Essex Yacht Club arrival in Antigua. But whoever goes will be able to see what is, I believe, probably the most iconic place in the world to see or certainly in the world I've been to see the sun go down. And really, whether you're a child or an adult, you can make some amazing memories in the Caribbean. And I really believe it is the best place, Antigua is the best place to begin and end the cruising season. So in closing, I will just say that Salty Dog is run by volunteers, just like the Essex Yacht Club. There's only one, well, I take it back. There's only one part-time admin that works for a Salty Dog, but most of our funding comes from vendors who want to snuggle up with people that spend a whole bunch of money on their boats. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share our story. As I said earlier, you experience it once and you can tell the story